Glúach Arstin, ha mé an dáchas gevéisih ulle gema. Learning a new language is a tricky thing. Learning a new way of writing is a tricky thing, and learning a new system of sounds is a tricky thing. So of course it's pretty tricky to learn both at once. So what are we going to do about it? For a lot of people, the answer seems quite simple. Let's just write it phonetically. But then if you say that, there's bound to be someone who will tell you that Gaelic is already written phonetically. This conversation becomes an argument as more heat is generated than light. So for now, let's just take as a compromise that Gaelic is written phonetically, but that it's not immediately useful to the learner because they don't know the system. That leaves the open question: is it useful to the learner in the long run to start with natural writing and avoiding artificial phonetics? Let's take a quick diversion first into the written word. What you see behind me now is just one letter lots of times. You don't have a problem recognising that all of these different shapes correspond to the same meaningful form. Some of them are slightly curvier, some of them are slightly cleaner and neater, but they are all an S, despite all their differences. These are different because they're in different typefaces. But if you were to sit down right now and write a sentence containing several S's, then look at the S's alone, you would find that the S's were all different, or at least fell into several different groups. Because the position your hand is in before it starts writing that S determines the shape at the start of the S. And the direction it's going to be leaving in to start the next letter is going to change how you end your S. So the shape of your S will be determined largely by the letters that come before and after. If you don't believe me, stop and have a try. It's certainly something you might not be aware of because your brain has learned to ignore these differences because these are not meaningful differences to you. To someone learning English as a new language who comes from a language with a very different script, such as Arabic, Chinese, or the Cyrillic script used in Eastern Europe, they're going to struggle sometimes to see two S's as being the same letter if the form is different enough. Pronunciation isn't that different. So if you think about the S's that I showed you, they are like different accents. We understand that people with different accents say the same thing in different ways. I don't imagine you'd have any problems telling that I don't know means the same thing as I don't know or I don't know. Same thing, different accents. Because the thing is, speech isn't simply a series of sounds. Speech is a series of shapes that you make with your mouth that we experience through sound. So in the same way that the shapes we make with our hands when we write depend on the letter before and after, the shapes we make with our mouths depend on the sounds we make before and after. And that means that what you consider one sound might sound very different in a different situation, but you wouldn't notice it because your brain recognises it for what it means, not the exact mechanics that you go through to produce it. So these meaningful units of sound, these almost letters of sound are called phonemes. And in our brains we have a map of these phonemes, where in our mouth one phoneme ends and another begins. And these maps depend on the language. So two things that sound very different in English may sound very similar to speaker of another language. And two things that sound very similar to a Gaelic ear may sound quite different to an English-speaking ear. When we're learning somebody else's accent in a language we already speak, all we have to do is learn to map their map onto our map, so that when they say that, it's what we would say like this. That's a fairly simple thing to do, but with a new language you are learning a new map. So this brings us back to the idea of writing it phonetically, because the moment you start to write something phonetically as a learner, you are writing it how it maps onto English. And a sound that might be on one side of the border in one region on the Gaelic map ends up sounding as though it's on the other side for you. Consider, for example, French speakers, German speakers coming to English and not being able to pronounce the. This is what happens. This is what happens. Or this is what happens. They can't tell the difference between the and the, or the and the. So they treat them as the same. So this brings us to the motivation for this week's lesson. A few weeks ago, I saw a tweet from the Daily Gael talking about shiv and shoe. This had been shared on a Gaelic group, and a native speaker from Uist got very confused by this and said, well, she'd never heard anyone say shoe in her life. And as the conversation went on, she said, well, oh yeah, because I must have heard it, but I never noticed it. Now, the reason she didn't notice it is because when she hears someone saying it, she hears someone saying it and processes it through her map of Gaelic. When you process it through your map of English, you hear shoe. But the word is shoe. Shoe. Now, the end there is a long W. Long W doesn't exist in English. But we have ew, and the w is held. And to an English-speaking ear, a w sounds like oo. It is the closest mapping that we have in English. But to a Gaelic speaker, oo is like the, because they are both ways of pronouncing BH. So your English speaking phoneme map is tripping you up. And if you deliberately try to think in your English speaking phonemes and write phonetically in your English speaking phonemes, you reinforce your brain's tendency and desire to use what it already knows, rather than training your brain to listen for the new information. So if you accept that shoe is sh, I, oo, and you remind yourself of that, then you will learn to hear it. But if you tell yourself that it's shoe, your brain will never hear anything else than shoe because it won't see a reason to. So I personally advise against focusing on accent early on, because you might be thinking, I want to sound like an uistach, so I want to say shoe. But if you sound quite like an uistach by saying shoe, then later on you might never get to the point where you sound a lot like an uistach by saying shoe. as they say, in English anyway, less haste, more speed. Cheers and draste, chi mi rischiv, or chi mi rischiu, if I see you in Newest.